Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is Professor Hamamoto on August 11, year 2024. The time Pacific Daylight Time is 4 p.m. And as you know, I have a very special guest today to join us. And I'm going to interview him about his specialty. He's a historian, a social historian, independent. And I think what he brings to our discussion of the New World Order as well as the current political system is that he has very well succeeded in connecting the local to the global and vice versa. It's a dialectical relationship. And he started with his family history and from there radiated outward and shows how it connects to these larger networks of power. And we have to think systemically so that we can overcome all these different distractions and personalities that cross the historical stage from time to time. Once we understand the long-standing cross-generational system related by blood, family ties, then we can begin to challenge a system that we more fully understand rather than being distracted by celebrity and these actors, some of them quite literally actors. So before I begin, I just want to direct you to at least 3 previous talks that I've given on this channel. And don't forget to subscribe if you're new to the channel. You might want to look at these for backstory. Most immediately, just last week, I did a talk called True Crime and connected with the American political establishment in Oakland County, Michigan, which Detroit Dave, as I affectionately call him, will be talking about in a moment. And then I had a previous interview with David Cranmer Underdown that you might be interested in. It's called Secret Detroit with Mr. David Cranmer Underdown. The links are down below. Try to make it easy as possible for you. Check that one out. You can follow the trajectory of his evolution, the thought, historical thought. And then finally, this is where my personal history of Japan and Okinawa intersects with the history of the Cranmer Underdown people, perhaps. And that final talk that you can look at is called Freemasonry in Modern Japan, The Secret History Revealed. And I'll explain more how that connects with David's talk in a moment. You may be surprised at historical connections that were forged over 150 years, probably even earlier, going back to perhaps even the middle of the 16th century, that help explain this evolution of this system that we are living under in 2024. So with that introduction, I would like to bring on the stage Mr. David Cranmer Underdown. Welcome, Detroit Dave.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh, we are going to have some kind of talk here. Now, you were, young. I don't even know if you were born yet, but when you learned about it, but did you hear about the Oakland County killings? This is back in mid 70s to late 70s.
Well, I didn't hear about it, of course, because my mom was pregnant with me when it happened.
Yes.
So I was born in August of 1977.
Mm-hmm.
So and I didn't know anything about it until just a couple of years ago. It was something that was honestly shocking to me because, to have 3 children killed in Oakland County. For people that aren't familiar with Detroit, Oakland County is a very affluent community. It's rated one of the wealthiest communities in the United States regularly, and so to have children being murdered and abducted was very contrasting to the image that I had of it being one of the best communities in the United States to live in. So that, but I didn't know much. I didn't know anything about it. But there are there are some intriguing personal connections because, of course, the one of the victims, this is Timothy King. His dad was law partners with my next door neighbor's my next door neighbor.
Mhm.
So his dad, Timmy's dad, and my neighbor were both law partners together. So like I know the neighborhood where he lived and everything. So yeah.
Mhm. And Timothy King's father, who, as you mentioned, was an attorney, was not someone who's going to be deterred from finding the truth of these deaths here that were connected here. And I think you mentioned that one of the two major books written on the Oakland County child killers was authored by someone that used to go to your family's business establishment.
Yeah, yeah, it was so and gosh, I don't know the name off the top of my head of her book, but her last name was Keenan, and she was a customer at our family dry cleaning store, and actually her brother really to this day is best friends with my uncle Gibby. That they went to high school together and everything. So these are both families that grew up in Birmingham, Michigan, and Oakland County, went to the local public high school together. So
Mhm.
yeah, so that was yeah. So we know. So I knew that author. She was mostly a journalist for the Detroit Free Press.
Oh, I see.
Hmm.
It's no wonder then that she was able to put this book together, one of the two major ones that I've read. And the other one was by Ruben Appelman. I don't know if you know that book, but if people want to look at the previous talk here, I I do allude to that book. I think it's called Snow Killings, something like that. I have a copy of the book, but I didn't bring it with me. So the area, and it was I was shocked that because I associate with these types of sensational crimes with Los Angeles,
Hmm.
right, or New York. The Zodiac killer or whoever, Charles Manson. But this was a serial killing that officially has never been solved, but through journalistic efforts has been solved, at least to my satisfaction. These key players have been identified. Most of them I think all of them are dead. Yeah. So that brings us to uh, one of the primary reasons that I wanted to invite you, David, onto the show. And that is your familiarity with the Detroit automotive and energy elite.
Hmm.
Because you've talked about, is it Con Ed that's big out in Detroit?
Well, there's the Detroit Edison Company is now called
Okay.
Detroit DTE,
Okay.
and then there was Consumers Energy is the big electric power supplier. But these are all this history I actually know a lot about because my great my great grandfather, who was named William Underdown, was recruited by a man named Alex Dow to come to Michigan from Ithaca, New York. He was from Trumansburg, New York, which is next to Ithaca. He went to Cornell's Ag School,
Hmm.
and he was recruited by Alex Dow to become the farm manager for the Detroit Edison Company.
The
So
farm
he is
manager?
the
Farm?
farm manager for Detroit Edison.
Okay, what is that? Is that agricultural farm you're talking about?
He was a Cornell Agricultural School
Right.
alumni, class of 1904.
I see.
And then he was brought in to buy really to buy real estate along the rivers because the damming and electric power was becoming a big thing.
Ah,
Alex Dow was the president of Detroit Edison Company, so he
okay.
was and he was also historically really interesting because he was actually the man that employed Henry Ford at Detroit Edison, and when he went to New York to the Consolidated Edison convention in 1898, he introduced Ford to Thomas Edison. Their first ever introduction of Ford and Edison was under Alex Dow. And that was when Ford pitched that he wanted to make a car and get away from um, the electrical power business. So that
Mhm.
same Alex Dow was the person that recruited my grandpa, and then my grandfather or great grandfather, and my great grandfather subdivided Barton Hills, which is the community adjacent to Ann Arbor. And so the first two houses in that community were Alex Dow's house, which was called Brushwood. And then the second house was the William Underdown house. And that was on Underdown
Wow.
Road in Barton Hills. Yeah.
Were they neighbors or next door neighbors or just
They were the
in?
first two houses. They worked together.
Oh,
Vivian Dow and Helen, my great grandma, were very close friends. They worked together. So, yeah, they would have been,
okay.
they would have known each other very well.
Now, you probably know this, but Cornell University was the very first land grant institution in the U.S., and it was created by an act of Congress, the Morrill Land Grant. And from there, they spawned Ohio State, University of Indiana, the University of California.
Yes.
But now
I knew
you're
it.
explaining to us how integral that is to the amassing of so much power, literal power and political power
Well,
and wealth.
well, part of what makes the story even more intriguing is that Andrew Dixon White, who was the first president of Cornell and was the Yale roommate of Daniel Coit Gilman,
Right.
who know later out at Cal Berkeley and Hopkins. He was first hired at the University of Michigan and planted the elm trees on the famous diag in the middle of the campus at University of Michigan. So the
Mhm.
diag, which is short for the diagonal, which is on the main campus where the students, all of the academic buildings and whatnot at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. It's famous for the trees on it. Of course, Ann Arbor is for arbor, for the trees. So it's the tree city. And so Andrew Dixon White, the famous Cornell founder, was the person that planted those trees. And of
Mhm.
course, that was the specialty of my great grandfather coming from Cornell. Was he was an arborist, and he
Mhm.
planted the trees in Barton Hills. So that's always been very fun for me. That's kind of a just like an intrigue. So yeah, it's fun.
And you mentioned in another interview that your grandfather, um, let's see, was not directly related to Dow. Was it DOW? But you,
So
Alex
this
Dow?
this is the same. Yeah. So this is the same person. So
Right.
this is William Underdown that's working for Alex Dow,
Mhm.
which is the same spelling, but he has kind of an intriguing background. He doesn't have the he's not the he's from Scotland. They say he has no education, but he becomes the president of Detroit um, Edison Company. And then, of course, there's the Dow Chemical Company in Midland, Michigan, which is, roughly 100 miles north of Detroit, I'd say. And that's, another Dow family. But I don't know if
Mhm.
they're exactly connected, but I, of course, have a lot of, interesting connections with the Dow family with through architecture.
Mhm.
The Alden Dow was one of the Frank Lloyd Wright collaborators and whatnot, and I actually went to a really interesting talk on that at Cranbrook School, which we've talked about, which is
Mhm.
the school in Bloomfield Hills. And the person that gave the lecture was actually the son of the chairman of Dow Chemical from Midland, and he was a boarding student at Cranbrook. And
Mhm.
he had done a renovation project on this home in Idaho that was a Frank Lloyd Wright house, and so he gave this lecture, and it was very interesting. Hearing him talk about because Cranbrook has a very rich architectural history. We've talked about this Sarnen family, Albert Kahn, that you very nicely
Mhm.
sent me the biography of him right after I mentioned him another time, and but also with Japan, because you have the Yamasaki, ends up in Birmingham and Troy, Michigan. And so
Hmm.
when he designs the World Trade Center, that is from his offices in Troy, Michigan, that he does that design.
Hmm. Well, I forgot about that pieces of information, the Yamasaki connection, and we're going to return to Japan before we end this cast today. There's some interesting connections that reach back a couple hundred years, but your part of your family is of Scottish descent. And then Alex Dow has kind of a mystery background, but he was born in Scotland. So from there, can we possibly infer, and we can speculate so long as we're clear about it that this is speculation, not definitive at this point. But could there be a Knights Templar connection that helped your grandfather get in with Alexander Dow,
I
since they
think
were
so.
kinsmen?
Yeah. No, I mean, my family has there was never any talk about that kind of organization. I never heard of it. None of my I didn't know anybody growing up that was affiliated with it. As far as I knew, they never introduced me to it. So I was not, and I wasn't into kind of the medieval. They'd have like the different medieval times, and that they'd have those medieval fairs and stuff. I was never really into all that stuff growing up, so I didn't get into it. But it's my great grandma is the one that I think is the one that's the intriguer on this, because she was Helen Douglas, which of
Mhm.
course in Scotland, the Douglas family is, there's the Douglas cause and the intrigues of, lady, um, uh, the different, the different Lady Margaret Douglas is the grandma of, Mary Queen of Scots and whatnot. So you have all these different like Douglas connections.
Mhm.
She was also from Trumansburg. So she was and there's really no background on her, but the reason I've pieced this together, it's a little bit long winded, but she marries my great grandfather in New York. They moved to basically to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where they become associated with the Dows. There's no information on her family really, but his brother. This is my great grandfather, William Douglas's brother. He ends up
Mhm.
working for a guy named Cary Sanger, who was the Undersecretary of War under Elihu Root. And this is right when Roosevelt, has become the president. So he has Root, who's a really important person with his law career and with his Secretary of State and, treaties, whatnot. He was at this point, he was Secretary of War. So the undersecretaries is William Cary Sanger and
Mhm.
Milton Underdown, who's the great uncle or whatever. He works for this William Cary Sanger on his experimental farm in Long Island. And William Cary Sanger happens to be married to I think it's Mabel Cleveland Ethel Dodge. She
Oh,
was
yeah.
an heiress of the Phelps Dodge mining
Mhm.
interests. And the Phelps Dodge family got out of the business, and they had a man named William Douglas that came in and became the engineer for Phelps Dodge Company. And he was from Toronto. And the reason why I think he has a strong Knights Templar intrigue is because he went to Egypt and he got the mummy of Ramses II and brought it
Oh
to
my
Buffalo, New
gosh.
York. So that's a pretty strong Knights Templar kind of a potential rub.
Ramses the second, and where did he? I'm sorry, I stepped on your last part.
He
Where's
ended up
the
in
mummy?
Buffalo, New York,
In a
in
private
Buffalo.
museum or private hands or a
I
university?
have to look it. I have to look it up. I feel like they had it in a museum in New York, but I don't know if it went back to Egypt. I have to look, but
Mhm.
I'm not sure. But that's but there's and again these are not like strong connections, but they're things that I just noticed from looking at pictures and knowing people and like so this Gibby that I talked about earlier, Uncle Gilbert,
Mhm.
he has his brother is Billy, who's my other uncle Billy, and their dad it was William Underdown, my grandfather David Jewett Underdown's brother, And he was the one, this is Uncle Bill, he's the one that married Jenny Jerome from Grosse Pointe, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And Jenny Jerome is interesting because her family has the oldest family business in the state of Michigan.
Huh.
They have a surveying business that goes back to the, I think, 18th century.
Wow. Talk
And
about Knights Templar and
and
Freemasonry.
and
Surveying?
guess who her cousin was?
Thomas Jefferson?
Jenny Jerome.
Oh,
Jenny Jerome, Leonard Jerome, the big, you sent the thing earlier about Matt Commodore Perry.
yes.
Leonard Jerome was the business partner of August Belmont in the Belmont Stakes. That was
Mm-hmm.
that was Leonard Jerome, his daughter Jenny. They were originally from Connecticut, but this is going back to colonial times. But there was a New York Jerome branch that ended up in Madison Square in New York
Mm-hmm.
City, in Madison Square.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the Westward Ho Jeromes that went to Detroit, Michigan, and started the surveying business. So yeah, there's a lot of intrigue because now you're going to get into Augustus Woodward, who was close friends with Jefferson, very close friends with Jefferson, that did the master plan of the
Mm-hmm.
city of Detroit. So yeah, you get all those characters are brought in right there.
Well, this is where I like to bring in the metaphysical. That has geomancy written all over it. Does it not? Ramses II, these people have an obsession with the afterworld or the afterlife and death and mummification, preservation of bodies and organs, and trafficking thereof. And they have a wonderment, an obsession with it. Um, the way the cities are lined along the Ohio River, along the Mississippi, Cairo, for example, we were talking about earlier, there's just so many pointers, markers that tell us that we really need to look at this occulted knowledge. It's an embodied, I mean, you were the one who told me,
Yeah.
informed me, I learned from you that the largest Freemasonic temple in the world is in Detroit.
Yes. With the trowel, with the cornerstone trowel from George Washington himself, used for the cornerstone in
And
Detroit.
where was the cornerstone pillaged from? Which ancient civilization?
I don't know, but it's again it. Another thing that I need to add to that William Underdown and to the Helen Douglas Underdown story, which was really important,
Mm-hmm.
was that William died young. He died in 1930 in a car crash, and his wife Helen blamed Henry Ford by name for his death.
In what
Which
way? I mean, specifically
so
how?
so specifically, you have to remember Alex Dow was the employer of Henry Ford in the 19th century. So
Right.
Ford and Dow would have known each other for 30 plus years at that point.
Mm-hmm.
You also have a company called the Detroit Aircraft Corporation, which is based on a place called Grosse Ile, Michigan. And the Detroit Aircraft Corporation has a aviation side. It also has a lighter than air side, or Zeppelin, or balloon side. And this company is incorporated in Grosse Ile, Michigan. And the people that back it are Henry Ford, Edsel Ford, Charles Kettering, who is the namesake of, Memorial Sloan Kettering. He was the
Mm-hmm.
head engineer for the General Motors Corporation for 40 years,
And there's a Kettering, Ohio, I believe.
named after him. He
Yes.
was the founder of Delco. He was
Mm-hmm.
from Dayton, Ohio, and he worked for the National Cash Register Corporation, and then he started the Automatic Starter. And when he created the Automatic Starter, then they created the company Delco. And he had a couple other people from Dayton that he worked with, and then he moved up to Detroit and was hired by the General Motors Corporation. And so that's Charles Kettering. And then there's a man named William Bushnell Stout, who was the person that created the Ford Trimotor. which was a aviation motor. And he started his career at the Scripps Booth Automotive Company, which of course is, intriguing because that's the same families that started the Cranbrook School, was the
Hmm.
Scripps and the Booth family, which, of course, a lot about Scripps being a Southern California person. That's a big name
Right.
in
Down in
Southern
San Diego.
California.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, before we get too far afield, Alexander Dow's widow blamed Henry Ford for.
My great grandma, who was
Okay.
best friends with Vivian Dow, Helen
Okay.
Douglas.
Okay. Yeah.
And so then she moves to a smaller house in Barton Hills. And then um, she ends up actually dying of an accidental fire, of burning to death in Connecticut, which I always thought was really odd. And
Mhm.
then the other thing that's very interesting about the whole scenario also was my grandfather, who was only 14 years old at the time. The story was that he threw a peanut in the air and ingested it in his lung, collapsed his lung, and had to go live in the Trudeau Sanitarium on Lake Saranac, New York, for 2 years in an iron lung from age 14, through 15. And
Mhm.
so he was at this Trudeau Sanitarium, and that Trudeau Sanitarium is um, it's on Lake Saranac, but it's the property adjacent to what's called the Knollwood Club. And the Knollwood Club is interesting because that's where you have the Guggenheims, you've got the Blumenthals, the Lazard Frere Blumenthals. Eugene Mayer's sister is married to the Blumenthal. But the one that's really intriguing is Lewis Marshall. And Lewis Marshall is really intriguing because he was partners with Jacob Schiff, who was the big financier from Kuhn and Loeb in New York
Mhm.
that did quite a bit with Japan, also
Mhm.
financing. But this Lewis Marshall is the person that goes after specifically Henry Ford and the Dearborn Independent newspaper. So Lewis Marshall, this lawyer from New York, that's law partners with Samuel Untermeyer, and of course the Untermeyer
Wow.
Park is where the whole, Son of Sam story takes place.
Yes. Yes.
So that's the person that goes after um, Henry Ford, the Dearborn Independent, the international.
When you say
Go ahead.
go after, you mean acquire or to snuff him out?
Goes him out in federal court, sues Henry Ford in federal court, and
I
makes
see.
him have a public apology for his publishing of those materials.
I see. So he was gonna get him with lawfare.
It's intriguing when you go down the line though, because then you get to the Ford Motor Company and the Whiz Kids era that we've talked about, and you also have the
Mhm.
Ford Foundation, where you have Edsel and Henry both dying, and then you have a young Henry Ford II coming in, bringing in the Whiz Kids, having the Ford Foundation be this giant organization with a international reach and impact.
Mhm.
And the person that's really seemingly behind the strings helping him and guiding him to hire these whiz kids is, I think, just a 27-year-old, the head of one of the largest corporations in the world. I think it's Sidney Weinberg from Goldman Sachs.
Hmm.
I think he is the person that is really orchestrating a lot of the intrigues that we're going to talk about with Detroit, because not only did Weinberg um, help Ford bring in the whiz kids, this new strategy of using technology and uh, computer analytics, data analysis to
We're
run a
talking about Robert
corporation.
McNamara and so forth, right?
McNamara is involved.
Mhm.
Yeah, I
The
mean,
Harvard MBA people.
yes, and so, but they also had you also had the Ford Foundation is intriguing with Horace Roland Gaither that had the experience at the MIT Rad Lab during World War II. He was the person that wrote the doctrine for the Ford Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
But then the other big intrigue with Weinberg, and this is the chairman of the Goldman Sachs Bank, is that he also was the person that had this close relationship with Dwight Eisenhower. And so when Eisenhower had been, the president at Columbia University, he was sort of developing these think tanks at Columbia, and the person that was kind of giving him contacts in the business and banking world, because Eisenhower had been a career military man.
Mm-hmm.
So the person that was really guiding him was Weinberg. And one of the people that was a key figure was the Secretary of Defense, and that was Engine Charlie Wilson, who'd been the chairman of General Motors Corporation, and he becomes the Secretary of Defense under Eisenhower. So,
Mm-hmm.
and that's
Now,
another
that's a
real person.
really great backstory there. It's interesting to see that they were fighting amongst themselves, just like we're seeing infighting now. That's really what's going on today. There's two main factions of industrialist New World Order people that are duking it out. We're actually not even involved. We're not even at the spectator level, but they have us invested in candidate A or candidate B. But there's a civil war, but it doesn't involve us. We are just collateral spectators to this intrigue that indie media and the networks, legacy media, puts us in there. And we have a whole new breed of YouTubers who rah, rah, hip, hip. Joe Rogan's going to support candidate, blah, blah, blah. Jesse Ventura is going to support Harris, right? But what I'm trying to get at is that the real civil war is amongst these competing factions that control the political economic structure behind the scenes. Most people don't even know these people's names. But they're the ones who are calling the shots, so to speak.
Well, I mean, I think you have to look. I think that we're, looking at what you've been doing as far as the university setting as a place where you recruit and train and kind of get, the next generation of people directed to the, places they need to go as far as,
Mm-hmm.
having their role. But I mean, it is, yeah, I don't know. As far as the people,
Well,
it is pretty amazing that there are so many in this Oakland County area.
yeah, the reason why I asked you to present the backstory is because this mysterious elite, and some of these names are given out in the Appleman book in particular, point to the energy and transportation or automotive elite as being part of this nationwide pedophile network,
Yeah.
using people like Francis Sheldon as their front person. Do you think there's that Appleman is correct in his hypothesis? Because none of these people they might have been indicted, but none of them were convicted or served any prison time. What do you think of that thesis?
This is hard. This is the challenge that I had. I feel like the last time we spoke was we talked about Robin Williams and
Oh, yes.
his father and their home, which is right on Updike, which was later owned by Sergei Fedorov with Anna Kournikova, the beautiful tennis player there.
Mhm.
I never got invited to those parties. I feel like I knew all the people. I didn't get invited to a lot of this stuff, and I don't know what happened. But I can put together people like Engine Charlie Wilson, who lived on Long Lake Road about, a mile from the Robin Williams house, and he was the chairman of the General Motors Corporation, and he was the Secretary of Defense that put together the new look strategy of warfare with Alan Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles under Eisenhower's administration. But as far as that thesis specifically, and I didn't see it, so I don't know.
Mhm.
I feel like I can give a lot of back information on characters, but I did not personally,
Mhm.
even though I can go through and tell you about the Sheldons. And of course, he was very close. He was somebody that was very active in Grosse Pointe, where his family was from, and also Ann Arbor and Bloomfield Hills. And
Mhm.
he was close with the Cranbrook community. And of course, that was the same group that my grandmother, the Cranmer, the Steubenville Cranmer,
Mhm.
she was, my dad's classmate, and really his best friend was the grandson of the founders of Cranbrook. So his name was Peter
Mhm.
Booth, and his grandpa was George Goff Booth, and then his grandma was not Ellen Browning Scripps, but a different Ellen Scripps,
Mhm.
and um, that was who my grandma was socially friends with, and that included
Mhm.
Charles Lindbergh for part of the
Mhm.
time. He was working for Henry Ford at the Willow Run factory in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and his kids were going to Brookside, and they were renting a house in Bloomfield Hills.
Mhm.
So he's very intriguing historically because, of course, he was, had a relationship with the German aviation people, obviously, and then
Mhm.
he became somebody in the America First movement, and he had a very controversial wife who was also very involved in the Cranbrook School. She actually became a student at Cranbrook. They have a graduate, art program, and she did that. And the kids went to Brookside. So yeah, it's just wild that the same, Uncle Henry Booth that, was Peter's uncle that invited the Lindberghs to live at Cranbrook is the same guy that brought, Leonard Bernstein to Cranbrook, also kind of a different side, very polar opposite sides of the spectrum as far as a, kind of an America First, you know, Lindbergh.
Versus
And
Bernstein, who invited most famously the Black Panthers to one of his soiree in in Manhattan. But just so people know who you hung out with and why you weren't invited to the parties, is that you went to Detroit Country Day School at an earlier time, of course, the same school that Robin Williams attended, whose
yes,
father was a automotive executive before they moved to Marin County in
mhm.
California, right across the bay from San Francisco. So those are
The-
your how come you never got invited to the birthday parties and the
well,
debutante balls and the coming
well, I
out
got to go
parties?
to a lot of good parties. I will not. I got to go to a lot of great parties. I had the bar mitzvah era in middle school was fantastic. I got to go to all the fanciest places, and that was amazing. And the Country Day was a really diverse school. Another really important character that's a Country Day alumni is, of course, Steve Ballmer. Can't forget
Yes.
Mr. Microsoft and Mr. Los Angeles Clippers owner now too.
Mhm. If I
So
may,
he's
I just want to show a very short clip of the Freemasonic Temple in Detroit,
oh
Michigan, just
boy.
very quickly.
The magnificence of the building seems out of place today in the midst of a neighborhood that is more gritty than grand. The Masonic Temple seems proud of its splendor and history. When it was completed in 1926, it was the largest building of its kind in the world.
The architect was a very famous architect named George Mason.
And he designed a building for the ages. While many of us think of it as an entertainment venue, the temple is so much more. It is 500,000 square feet, with
Detroit, Dave, have you been in
Yep.
there?
Yes, I have been. I've been in one time, and of course it's the intrigues of who invited me and the people I met are amazing. The
Well,
it was
spill the
like a
tea.
what's that?
Spill the tea.
So it was a fundraiser for I think it was the Tigers. They did these kind of art pieces, like giant tigers for the Detroit Tigers, and like different groups would buy, sponsor one and paint it and customize the tiger, and then they do the charity auction, and then all the money would go to I guess the Masonic Temple. I don't know.
Mhm.
But so I went to that event, and the person that took me was one of my friends from growing up that was a Kingswood girl named Kate Richard, and she of course has a General Motors background. And when another girl from here got married in West Palm Beach at the fanciest wedding I'll ever go to.
Mhm. Oh, you were there. You went.
I got
You
to go
attended.
to the Everglades Club. Professor Hamamoto. I went to all the fancy places. I got to go to the beach and tennis club. I got to go to Mar-a-Lago.
Why do I feel so ghetto?
Because
I am.
I think that honestly, there is an old connection between my family and those families, because the girl that was getting married was the Fisher, as in the Fisher body, and
Yes.
the Fisher
Body by
building.
Fisher.
What's that?
Yeah, on all the Chevys it said Body by Fisher.
Body by Fisher.
Stamp
So
on it,
this was a
stamp on it.
Fisher heiress that was getting married, and her and the Fisher building is the building that had WJR, the radio station, the WJR Radio 760, and that radio station was originally in Pontiac, Michigan, and it was founded by the Jewett brothers, and the Jewetts were Harry Jewett and Edward Jewett, and they started the WJR radio station. They started the Page Detroit auto company, and WJR happened to be the first station that put someone named Father Coughlin on the radio.
Mhm.
Remember Father Coughlin?
Oh, yes.
So Father Coughlin was the radio priest from the Shrine of the Little Flower in Royal Oak, Michigan. And he had one of the greatest reaches, I guess, of any figure in that period. And he had a syndicated radio show. And it was originally broadcast from 760. And then, of course, 760 goes to the Fisher building, becomes the headquarters of WJR radio.
Mhm.
So, it's one of those things where I didn't ever, really know that family, but they were an example of one of the, families, like, I think that was one of the things you wanted to talk about, was sort of the old Detroit families. And that's a very interesting family, not just because of their, the auto history with Fisher Body, but also because there's the Jewish Fishers from this area that come into play through the Purple Gang, through Max Fisher. So in Detroit, you have your Catholic Fishers and your Jewish Fishers, and both are very intriguing.
Mhm. They probably did some interesting collaborations. So you've been to Mar-a-Lago. You've been to some of the top hotels in Palm Beach.
I saw Ivanka Trump and her friends at the pool. Believe it or not, she came in with the girls. It was unbelievable.
How long ago was this, David?
I would say probably 12 to 15 years ago.
Okay.
It was a while ago, but there's a lot of there's a lot of intrigue, because of course Mar-a-Lago is Marjorie Merriweather Post, and of course the Post, Postum was originally discovered, I believe, at the Kellogg Sanitarium in Battle Creek. So there's a lot of kind of intriguing Michigan to Florida, and again, we're talking about our Knights Templar. A big part of that, I think, is the Lincoln Highway and the Dixie Highway, and those were the predecessors to the Eisenhower interstate freeway system.
Oh, I see.
But the people that were really involved in that were from the Packard Motor Company. It was Henry Bourne Joy and a guy named Carl Fisher, who again is another kind of Fisher intriguing person. But he was the Dixie Highway, and Fisher Island in Miami was named after him. And that's another kind of place of intrigue that comes up.
Now, I have to ask you this, and if you don't know, that's okay, but you're free to speculate. How about Interlaken, Michigan? What's this from a person who was born and raised in the state of Michigan? What's the scoop on Interlaken? What did you hear about when you were growing up?
So there's two major things. One, the first one was that all of the elite musicians from Country Day, which is the elite of the most elite school in Detroit, would go to Interlaken, and it was a super prestigious thing, and people from all over the world went there, and it was I didn't know much about it because there was no talk of the kind of the Epstein and Maxwell, renting the cottage and all that stuff. That was not in the public discourse because it was really just like I was somebody that was like a lacrosse player. So like in the summer, I would go to like these lacrosse camps because I wanted to become a lacrosse player in college. So you would go to the lacrosse camp where the coaches would go and they'd scout you. And it was, to me, that was sort of what the Interlaken was like. If you were the top musician and you were trying to get into Juilliard or, some music school, that's a real, feather in your cap, as my grandma Key would say, is to go there. So it wasn't like, it wasn't sleazy at all. It didn't have a reputation of being anything other than, I would say, the best musicians going there.
Mm-hmm.
But as you go through life, you learn more things. One of the personal intrigues that ties to what we just saw was that the girl that was my dad's high school girlfriend was named Patty Mason, and she was the Interlaken student or whatever. She was a musician, a very great musician.
Mm-hmm.
And so she went there, but her uncle was named also George Mason, not the George Mason of Mason and Rice that did the Masonic Temple
Mm-hmm.
that Albert Kahn worked for before he went on his own. That George Mason. This is a different George Mason. He was the founder or the merger of the Hudson Automobile Company with let's see, it was Hudson, it was Packard, Nash, and Kelvinator, and it became the American Motor Corporation. And part of the intrigue with that story was that just shortly after American Motor was formed, he got pancreatic cancer, died, and that's when George Romney, the father of Mitt, becomes the chairman of the American Motor Company.
Well, there seems to be a lot of early deaths, premature deaths amongst these executives and accidents, automotive accidents.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know
Definitely.
if it's device statistics, but again, who were the rivals of the the Knights Templar, the Hashashin, the Ishmaelis? They traded craft work, as they were trying to conquer their part of the world. And part of my argument is that those ancient rivalries and tensions were transported to the New World of North America and Latin America as well. And furthermore, if you don't mind me saying this, I think the Cranmer and the Underdown bloodlines themselves harken back to these earlier settlers that go back before the days of the American Republic for sure, but definitely preceding Cristoforo Colombo, who himself was a Knights Templar. His flag was on the 3 ships. So does that sound plausible for your own family history? And this is why these marvelous opportunities were made available to you?
Well, one of the areas that we were talking about before that's so interesting is Newport, Rhode Island. And and again, I didn't know anything about this, but there's sort of a Knights Templar intriguing element there. It's called the they call it either the Newport Tower or the Old Tower, and it was owned by a Benedict Arnold, who was the grandfather of the Benedict Arnold that everybody thinks of as being the great trader.
Mm-hmm.
And the Benedict Arnold family is related to is to Stephen Arnold Douglas, who, later becomes a senator in Chicago, in Illinois, and then, has this kind of rivalry with Abe Lincoln with the debates and whatnot. So that's why the Douglas name is intriguing to me, because there was connections with that, the Arnold family. And then the other thing that was really interesting about that, because this Newport Tower is suspected that it was built by the Sinclairs, by the Knights Templar. That's part of the folklore of it, and there's other competing theories on how it came to be. But it's very interesting to me that it was Benedict Arnold that was a settler. But who bought the site, the cemetery and the homestead of the Arnolds?
Jeff Bezos.
Judah Touro.
Who?
Judah Touro.
Touro.
Touro. Yes, the Sephardic,
of
the
Newport?
Touro Synagogue in Newport, the oldest
Yes.
Sephardic
Yes.
synagogue in North America.
Uh-huh.
And his brother-in-law is Moses Michael Hayes, the one that I sent you the picture of.
Mm-hmm.
That was the founder of the Masonic Temple in Boston with his deputy, Paul Revere.
Mm-hmm.
The founder of Bank of Massachusetts, Michael Moses Hay. That's pretty
Right.
Knights Templary to have the second chartered bank in United States.
Absolutely. And we think
Yeah.
about those mighty manufacturing centers like Detroit, like Chicago, especially the automotive industry. How do they capitalize that? Well, they said, well, the big banks do it. But who are running the banks? The original bankers of the emerging global order, which were the Knights Templar. They were getting it through their networks in the Masonic lodges and the Shriners and the other groups. That was part of the personnel that they were drawing from that capitalized American industry. So it's no surprise that they believe that this is their land. And people like me are just sort of interlopers. We're just passing through. They're the ones who have have the true lease, the landhold of what is now the United States of America.
I don't know. It's interesting thinking about all that, the charters and the original colonies and all, because that, that's it's relevant, as far as which banking institutions were financing things like the Virginia Company or the Massachusetts Bay Company, Plymouth Colony. All these things were, you had to have boats. You had to have people that knew what to do when they got there. They could build a port and build a port city and have an education system and all
and
those
do all
things
the
were
surveying,
needed.
the land surveying.
The surveying was huge, but and that was what they wanted, to be able to survey land so that when they would go back to their monarch, they could, divide up the territory.
Did you learn American history from the perspective that you've been pioneering, the way you've been laying it out for the past several years? Did you have any inkling at all that this is the true history?
I learned so much about history from my grandpa Key, the one that was from Indiana, from Bloomington. He was like, when I first started listening to the George Webb show, the reason I liked George's talks was because his presentation reminded me of my grandpa Key.
Mm-hmm.
Very deep knowledge on the subject, could explain things in a way that was understandable, really like subject matter expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was kind of my model for what I, and he'd be the person that we did a lot of road trips as a family. We would drive around and go to national parks, and they lived in Bloomington, Indiana. So we would go, do all these trips with them. And he would know, like, every crop. If you saw any kind of power line or anything, he would know the entire map of where it came from, all of those things. Like, he was very knowledgeable. And he was
a polymath, an old-fashioned polymath.
He was a true polymath. He was like, unbelievably accomplished person. And when he retired from RCA, they said he had the most patents in the history of RCA. I don't know if that's true,
Mhm.
given like when I heard that I was a little kid and I didn't know what RCA really was at that point. I didn't know the scope of RCA,
Now, did
but
Mr. Keys ever tell you about his work down in Nashville back in the 20s and 30s?
in Nashville, Indiana,
No, Nashville, Tennessee.
Nashville, Tennessee. I don't know if he ever went there. But the things that make it so intriguing was the remember I sent you commented earlier today about the Harvard the dean of the Harvard law school that that had written that material on the Freemasons.
Oh, yes, yes. What's his not learned hand, but he
I
was
learned
he was a
hand.
Freemason. Um,
It's oh my gosh, I'm
Roscoe Pound, Dean
Roscoe
Roscoe
Pound.
Pound. Yeah,
So
Roscoe Pound.
Roscoe Pound, his second wife, right? This is why I wrote all the Elm Heights people. His second wife was Miss Barry's sister.
Ah,
Miss Barry was the one that got my grandpa the room in Bloomington when he was commuting from Princeton. And Miss Barry was the first female professor at Indiana University and the first department head. She was the head of the Latin department. And she was
wow.
much older than my grandparents, but she was very good friends with them. She would always have female students stay with her at her house in Elm Heights. And part of my show and tell is I have her honorary pin, Miss Barry. I don't know if you can see it that well.
Ah,
It's given
yeah.
to my grandma. It says Barry on the back.
That's an Ankh, isn't it?
It's a
Ankh, Egyptian.
it's the teacher honorary. Can you
Is
see it?
that Quill and Scroll or Phi Beta Kappa Key?
It's
I'm
a
not really
teacher.
sure.
It's an education for sorority. And
Oh,
then it
okay.
says, so let me see what it says. Oh my gosh, it's hard to read it.
But that's an Egyptian Ankh. That's a symbol of life.
So this is, yeah, and then her brother-in-law is this Roscoe Pound at
That's her brother-in-law?
yeah, it's her brother-in-law. And her and
Amazing.
when my mom moved to Bloomington in 1949, I don't know if you remember this story. So Willie Oppel, the head of the music
The
school,
music professor. Yeah.
knocks on the door. Not 1949. I'm here to be the head of the IU music department. I need a place to live. Can I
Mhm.
stay in your house? It was Miss Barry was the one that hooked that up. So that was Dr. Oppel lived with my mom for I think almost 2 years in her house, and that was then he bought the house diagonally behind them, and then the house next to them was Hermann Joseph Muller, who I've talked about. He was the Nobel Prize winner, the mentor to James Watson. Watson followed him from University of Chicago to Bloomington, and then about 3 houses from where Herman H.J. Muller lived was Alfred Kinsey, the one that you put on there. He lived three
Yes.
houses away with his
At the
yes,
University of Indiana fame.
and
That
and
Kinsey.
and Alfred Kinsey's wife was the brownie troop leader of my mom, and she made the terrariums, and there was nothing weird that happened. That's the thing. I know with Kinsey, everybody wants it to be all the orgies and the experiments and the Kinsey scale for gaydar and all that stuff. None of
Mhm.
that happened, according to my mom and her friend. I believe her.
Mhm.
I don't feel like there was a weird thing going on there, but that was who the leader of it was.
Wow. But you talked about the fly lab. I was in an earlier talk of yours, not this one.
Yeah.
But that was Kinsey's specialty, gull wasps. He was the
Hmm.
entomologist
So
and
the
the
fly,
eugenicist as well. And that's documented. He was a stone cold eugenicist.
yeah, there was unfortunately a lot of that all around. Someone that we talked about before, David Starr Jordan. He,
Mhm.
he had been the president of Indiana and was
Mhm.
recruited by the Stanfords to go out to Stanford, and he, of course, had that same background,
Yeah.
and was also very close with Andrew Dixon White, who was actually his
Mhm.
teacher at Cornell. So actually, Andrew Dixon White was offered the chancellorship of Stanford initially. He declined it and stayed at Cornell, and then he recommended his student David Starr Jordan to the Stanfords, and then he left Indiana to go to Palo Alto.
Some say David Starr Jordan had a hand in the poisoning, the strychnine poisoning of one of their founders.
There's so many, because Frederick Terman is also his
Yes.
dad is also from Bloomington, went to IU.
Oh, really?
Louis Terman is
Yeah.
an Indiana University local.
The Stanford Binet test, the IQ test, so-called.
The whole thing, and also don't forget the Clark University with Freud
Hall.
and
Stanley
Young
Hall.
coming to Clark University.
And
was all-
Stanley Hall was the guy that invited Freud over. Yeah, all these interconnections here, they all comes together as part of the larger consolidation of power here. And
do you know who Stanley Hall was college or high school classmates with? It's an amazing connection.
Let me guess. Al Gore? No, I'm kidding.
Elihu Root.
Of course.
Elihu Root.
Right.
Elihu. Yes.
Yeah, Secretary of State. This is during the 1930s, right? Or 20s and 30s. The interwar period between World War I and World War II, where these young men were gearing up for World War II against Japan.
Yeah.
Which they've had their eye on for about 100 years. So if I could pivot to that area, because this is where my background in Okinawa and Japan intersects with that of the Cranmer Underdown bloodline, Clan Douglas, and all these other Knights Templar from Scotland, from Aberdeen. And I did a talk, I mentioned it earlier, about the Freemasonic history in Japan, but Admiral Commodore Perry, right? He was the hero of these sea battles, Lake Erie, related, that was his brother. But Commodore Perry won at the Battle of Veracruz in Mexico with the U.S.-Mexico border, which helped to incorporate Mexican land to the U.S. And the year after, he sailed over to my people's country in Okinawa. He hung out that for about a year to scout around. And the following year, he sailed into the Tokyo area and said, we were going to open up Japan. That's the original gunboat diplomacy. It's all Freemasonic. Now, before that, well, after that, actually, was a guy from Aberdeen, the shipbuilding place in Scotland, Thomas Glover, who went there as part of an agent of Jardine Matheson, a name that you're quite familiar with. He was just sort of like a lowly scribe or something, but he was learning his lessons. And he hooked up with the local warlords in Nagasaki area, which had a long experience with foreign traders, especially the Dutch, right? The Dutch East Indies people. So he went in there and became a gun runner and helped organize the modern armies against the shoguns and the daimyo. And it's all been cataloged by those fake movies starring, of course, Tom Cruise and Keanu Reeves. It's a rewrite. They were not the last samurai. Saigo Takamori was. People like Ryoma Sakamoto were the true guys. But that's my history. If I can just show you a short clip of that. And it shouldn't be any surprise that Freemasons are very strong in Okinawa, which is still an American military stronghold. It's a base for East Asia. And they have the Grand Lodge in Tokyo. And they've been running, the Rothschild banks have been running Tokyo since 1909, roughly. And they helped fund the Russo-Japanese War. They helped fund the armament of Japan leading up to the Pacific War. This is the House of Rothschild and these other people that you mentioned that were based in Wall Street. Here's a very simple. Imperial crest, the chrysanthemum. Yeah, that last pick was Sakamoto Ryoma, who was trying to preserve the imperial system against the Freemasonic system, which was brought in starting around 1868, roughly, and paved the way for modern Japan, with World War II eventually becoming the outcome. So, David, we are related by the bonds of history.
Yeah, I love it. It's so funny. We had, like I said, we had such a diverse school. We had people from all different types of, all different cultures at
It was
Country Day,
international, yes.
and we had this dry cleaning business, and we had a really, we had great, a lot of great customers, and one of the ladies was Miss Suzuki, and her husband was a very famous car designer that worked for different, General Motors and Ford and Chrysler and whatnot. And when he passed away, she gave me his cashmere sweater. That was really, really nice gift. And I'd always had this very nice relationship with her. Like, she was just a really, person that, and I don't know if she was connected to the architect. I assume they are, just because of where they lived and kind of the level of their design,
Mhm.
But when she sold her house, the person that bought it was Reggie Bush, who was, again, another USC Heisman Trophy
Right.
person. So there are all these intrigues. Like, even the Cranbrook has the Japanese gardens as part of their
Mhm.
grounds, and so I even think of, when you ask me about history and how I'm doing it, my history. I had great history teachers at Country Day, but one of the things that my history teacher did was they showed us the movie Gung Ho. Do you remember
Oh,
Gung
yeah.
Ho?
Wow, with Long Duck Dung.
No, Gung Ho was
Was that the war
the
movie version?
what's that?
The war movie, the war picture? Or
No,
the
it was about the Japanese techniques for manufacturing.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, because that
Right.
was a big deal in Detroit in my childhood.
I remember that.
The lower price, kind of higher fuel efficiency Japanese cars versus the American was kind of a big deal. I mean, I feel like when you're in the Oakland County, it wasn't as much as the blue collar, kind of UAW people. I feel like we're a lot more kind of xenophobic
Yeah. They
than
were
what I would
smashing up
see.
automobiles from Japan with
Yeah,
sledgehammers. Right.
yeah, there was that, but it is.
Well, the people, your neighborhood, the executives, they were transferring productive capacity over to Japan. So they, they really didn't empathize with the working people. And then South Korea and then eventually China. But yeah, that was
and
that
one
pivotal moment.
and one of the big financial architects for MacArthur was Joseph Dodge, and
Uh,
he did the Dodge line, and his background was with the Comerica Bank, which was called the Bank of Detroit. He was a local Detroit banker, and then he goes on to be part of the Reconstruction policy with MacArthur in Japan. So there is, again, that legacy of the auto industry in United States versus other parts of the world, including Japan.
yeah, and part of their national automobile production policy in Japan was to use right-hand drive instead of left-hand drive because that would lock out American imports because they're driving on the other side like Britain. Clever. So it goes, and so it goes. It's still raging. Well, David, we've spent a wonderful hour traversing
I
centuries and
know.
centuries of history, and
I
there's
feel like we've
so
gone all over.
I
I
know.
wanted to just show the last surprise, though. I didn't get to
Please
show
show
the
me
one
all your
surprise.
your memorabilia.
Okay, so this surprise, this is my grandma, Helen Key, who was. Let's see if I can get it open here. Can you see it? Okay, there it is.
Oh yeah.
And then it has the star for the captain of the team.
Wow.
So this is the Indiana State fighting teachers. My grandma, Helen Pauley.
Uh-huh.
her letter sweater from being the captain of the basketball team of Indiana State, where she got her teacher's degree. And the reason why I thought you would like this so much was because Indiana State was the place where, of course, Larry Bird was the star basketball player.
Yes.
But for California basketball fans, I'm sure this is your whole childhood. John Wooden was from
Oh, yeah.
Martinsville, Indiana, and he played at Purdue. Then he coached at Indiana State before he was hired by the UCLA Bruins, and then he became the greatest of all time in many people's books. And so the Wooden Court is in which arena?
Pauley Pavilion
From
Steubenville,
Indianapolis, Indiana.
Indianapolis.
Yeah.
Okay, I knew it was on there. Well,
Yeah.
there's two main. I mean, in addition to the energy companies and automotive, there's two qualitative leadership position that the Midwest rules. One is basketball, and the other is band instruments. Elkhart, Indiana.
Yeah.
That was synonymous with band instruments. All the companies had their production facilities in Elkhart. They were all stamped on every instrument because I was in the marching band and orchestra.
That was an important thing that I forgot to mention, though, when you asked me about the Interlochen camp, is that in more modern history, American Pie is very important connection. Remember the movie American Pie?
Yeah, the Gross Out movie?
The gross out high school movies.
Right. It's kind of like Porky's.
Kind of like Porky's. Yeah, kind of a Porky's kind of theme.
Yeah, I remember.
Well, the writer of American Pie is from East Grand Rapids High School.
Oh, wow.
And so East Great Falls High School, the modeled school that the American Pie movies are based on, the entire band camp gag in the movie, which is a major part.
Oh, that's right.
Interlochen. It is based on Interlochen.
That's right.
So the whole flute, I know you know your flute.
I still remember that girl with the flute.
Yeah, this one time at band camp.
Oh my gosh.
That's Interlochen. It is based on Interlochen. So with all the scandal with Jeff and Ghislaine, you have these other competing intrigues, because East Grand Rapids is also the area that Gerald Ford is from. And Gerald Ford was, the star football player at University of Michigan, and then the president, that came in after Nixon and all this. So a lot of intrigues with silly, gross out Porky's style gags.
Yes.
But at the same time, when you look at who wrote them and what the legacy, because Grand Rapids is also, that's where, the DeVos family is from, and you have Eric Prince, and sort of the Blackwater group is big out there. So that's another big part of the story, and probably ties in with the Oakland County stuff equally as much as Oakland County, because there's just a lot of collaboration. You have to remember that on the map, that between Detroit and Chicago, this is where you're getting into, Ann Arbor, Lansing, Grand Rapids, Michigan, that's the route. So there's going to be historical relationships with Chicago and Detroit based on geography.
Right. Well, Francis Sheldon had a home and an office in Ann Arbor as well as outside Detroit, but he also had a base of operation in Aspen, Colorado. And I think he was providing the hoity-toity group down there, the ski people.
I can give you the whole rundown. I should forward you the essay that my dad's friend sent him.
About Aspen?
Yeah.
Oh,
you're going to want this one, because this is Bob Swanson. And Bob Swanson's mom is Pipsa Sarnen. So his uncle is Eero Sarnen. His grandfather is
the architect,
Elil. So he wrote this essay about being in Aspen at the Jerome Hotel, seeing Walter, I don't know if it's pronounced Pieke. It's like Paeke. He was the founder of the Aspen Institute.
I know the Aspen Institute.
So the person that designed the little like their very initial conference for the Aspen Institute was Eero Saarinen. So it was his
Okay.
uncle. That
Yeah.
that was the architect. That was his partner. So there was Saarinen, and Swanson was the architect firms, and so he was related to
Mhm.
him. But anyway, in his essay, he writes about this Walter Piecki's wife and the beautiful daughters and all this stuff. And that was the founder of the Aspen Institute. And the beautiful wife, her brother is Paul Nitze. Paul Nitze, as in
Right.
the NSC 68 that did a lot of Cold War military
Sure.
planning, that
The
created
national security expert.
national security, created Team B, created the
Mhm.
John Hopkins Institute for Advanced Studies. That's her
Wow.
brother. That's her
Yeah.
brother. And
Uh-huh.
so this
Her brother.
Saarinen is interesting because he was the architect for Cranbrook School. So you have the Cranbrook House was Albert Kahn, the
Uh-huh.
school was Saarinen, and this is the nephew or whatever. And he was writing this thing about being in Aspen, like when it was just a brand new resort. And
Mhm.
then you have the the stuff that George Webb was doing as far as out in Sun Valley in Idaho, and that was actually a very big part of the Dow chemical architect. He talked about that. His last name was Whiting, and
Mhm.
his dad was chairman of Dow, and they built what looked like the very first house in Sun Valley. There was nothing on the mountain. This was in probably the 40s or something like that.
Mhm.
And they built a home there, and then he ended up being out there where they have the whole Sun Valley conferences. So there's intrigues with with these different with these different families, with the scripts and the booths and the newspaper barons and whatnot.
Well, no wonder you have an aversion to the international style in architecture.
I'm not into it. I love Cranbrook. I named my dog after Bo Art's architecture. That's why it's called Bo,
Oh, I
and Bo
see.
Jackson, the football
Wow.
player.
Uh-huh.
But I like and I also have the deep attachment to the Indiana limestone because of the
Yeah.
cutters, remember from Breaking Away and the
Yeah.
cutters and all that
Yeah,
stuff.
the stone quarries.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And
Wow.
and Miss Barry's house was she just didn't want her home to be torn down, and the Tridelt house in Bloomington, which was a big
Mhm.
part of the Breaking Away movie, they
Mhm.
tore it down to make it into a parking lot. So Miss Barry didn't get her wish.
And also Francis Sheldon, I think it was Francis Sheldon's father had one of those custom designed homes in Palm Springs.
Yeah. And another family that
It's a
has
landmark
Sheldons.
property. Yeah, go ahead.
Another Sheldon in there that's always interesting is the Prescott Sheldon Bush is another Sheldon name.
And it's spelled Shelden, correct? Sheldon.
I'd have to double check it. I don't
Yeah,
know, but
that's
it's
the
a
Francis Sheldon. Yeah.
but that's another intrigue. I feel like I didn't tie off a lot of the things we talked about. The other major thing I wanted to mention with the Detroit Aircraft Corporation
Mhm.
was that when it went bankrupt in 1933, it was amalgamated to become Lockheed, and it moved to Santa Monica, California. So
Right.
what was in Detroit in this, pioneering aviation company moves to California. Then Lockheed, as you know from being a Southern California person, has
Mhm.
all the interest with the, with the U-2s and all the fighter jets and all that stuff.
Mhm.
So that's also tied in with the history of these things and the Lockheed financial scandals of the 70s.
Right, which, Norman Mineta was, kind of moderating that when he was a elective official, and it involved Japan. It was the bribery scandal, right? The 70s, Lockheed
Hmm.
again. And this was also you're talking about Lockheed and Douglas and all the aerospace industry that moved into Southern California beginning in the 50s. That's also where Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, was relocated from the Bay Area to Orange County, LA, the emerging next phase of aerospace, which was going to take us into the cosmos. That's Philip K. Dick. That's where he wound up in Orange County.
Yeah.
The people who were his fans, they call themselves dickheads, don't know this crypto history, but he is part of normalizing it through the science fiction genre and through the films that have been adapted for this very purpose. Because I see them as sort of like the Dodge family and the aerospace, Donald Douglas and people like that, Howard Hughes, as an extension of the people in your milieu back in Detroit,
Yeah,
the
it's
automotive people.
and it's absolutely correct, because even like North American aviation was owned by General Motors. Like Opel in Germany was owned by General Motors. Like Ford
Mhm.
had, you know, they did aviation at the Willow Run, which became the largest manufacturing facility in the world, was
Mhm.
where they made the B-24 bomber with Rosie the Riveter. That was a Ford factory. So that,
Mhm.
you know, anything with a motor, whether it's an automobile or a car or a tractor or a tank, those are all, they're all, you know, if you go through the history of Detroit and the arsenal of democracy, you'll see that, you know, all of those elements are, you know, really part of it. And then people like Eero Saarinen that I just mentioned, he becomes the architect for the GM Tech Center, which is where a lot of these intrigues also happen. In Warren,
Mhm.
Michigan, which is where the, you know, the tech center is built. So, you know, in the old tech center was called the Argonaut Building behind the general, you know, the GM headquarters, the Cadillac building, and the
Mhm.
person that owns it now is Alfred Taubman, and of course Taubman
Oh, yes.
is the mentor of Les Wexner,
Who
right?
comes out of Columbus,
And
correct?
but Taubman comes out of Pontiac,
Oh,
Michigan.
I see.
So he's the luxury mall tycoon. He
Right.
owns the, you know, malls all over the country, and the person that brings the retail to the mall space is Leslie Wexner with his
Okay.
different outfits. So this is
Wow.
somebody that, when I just mentioned the Robin Williams's house at the corner of, you know, Long Lake Road and Woodward, across the street is where Taubman had world headquarters.
Wow.
Across the street, Woodward, the other side is where Saarinen and Swanson is. On the other side of the street is Bloomfield Country Club. That's where George Romney lived, where Mitt and everybody, you know, went to school. So they're all in that area. So that's why, you know, all this stuff is so intriguing, because I do feel like even what you just said with that Donald Douglas,
Mhm.
Douglas was the original Rand Corporation partner, and then they
Ah,
broke it off, and there was the Ford Foundation that moved them to California, and they chartered in Santa Monica under the state of California, and it was the Ford Foundation
all right.
that transferred it from Douglas to,
Mhm.
you know, the California uh, um, nonprofit organization. So all those things are, you know, there's a lot of crossover between Ann Arbor and Detroit, and then, you know, getting into, you know, things like that with the you know, Southern California. So
Now, the pic I used for this on YouTube was a photo of you as a high school student. Was that
mhm.
when you were back then? Did you ever imagine you'd be doing what you're doing, your type of work?
No,
In a way, you're like spilling the tea on your own social class.
I don't, you know, this the thing is that I feel like, honestly, like my method is to take my family, look at who's around them,
Mhm.
who's always the loser in the story is always their family. You know, if you're
Mhm.
the one that like burned to death, or had a kid, you know, drowned in a well, or had a meteor fall out of the sky and hit you in a,
Mhm.
you know, field in southern Indiana, that was always the backstories.
Mm.
Um, there were a lot of bad, especially my dad's family. You know, they were this Steubenville, Ohio, and so you always had that sort of German, you know, or Prussian kind of flavor. But they were really tied in with the University of Michigan and the medical school. This is going back to the 19th century. So my
Mhm.
grandma, um, Jeanette, her brother, dad, father, and grandfather all got medical degrees from University of Michigan, going way, to the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I'm so interested in the history of University of Michigan, but also with the Steubenville, the Ohio River, because the other thing that is not often mentioned is James Burrell Angel, who was the chancellor of the University of Michigan.
I don't know that name. Yeah.
So there's Angel Hall, and his family is originally from Newport, Rhode Island. They're a deep Newport family.
Mm-hmm.
And his son becomes the chairman of Yale University, and his daughter-in-law is the founder of the CIA, the Culinary Institute of America at New Haven.
Mm-hmm.
That's his daughter-in-law. But that
where Anthony Bourdain went, didn't he go to CIA? Anthony
it's the
Bourdain?
best one. I don't know. It's the big one. It's the one.
Yeah.
It's the one in. It's the one in the old Addams family house in New Haven and all that stuff where they have the thing. But what I was going to say was this is a shocker. So in 1880, the president of the United States is Franklin Pierce. Excuse me. There's a problem in China with coolie slaves and with opium. Who are we sending to solve this, trade problem? James Burrell Angel, the chancellor of the University of Michigan, is becoming a special envoy for the United States to negotiate the coolies and the opium trade.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, again, it's like, well, why? That's an odd connection that you would send this university. So the reason I think that that's relevant is because his family was from Newport, and they were really close with the Hazard family, Roland Hazard. And Roland Hazard is interesting to people because they were the founders of the Alcoholics Anonymous. Roland Hazard was one of the founders. But what to me is the really intriguing was that they had the American patents for the Solway process. And they created the Solway Corporation in upstate New York that then later became one of the major components of the United Chemical Corporation. And that, of course, was owned by Eugene Mayer, that later becomes the, head of the Federal Reserve, the World Bank chairman. His daughter is Katharine Graham. He's
Washington Post,
the whole thing. And that was his original thing was Lazard Frere Bank. His family was very connected with Lazard, California, out by you in LA and San Francisco. Mm-hmm. But he was also in this Allied Chemical, which was a monster. And I think it was the American equivalent of IG Farben, a consolidation of major American chemical companies into the Allied Chemical Company. And I think it was underwritten with $175 million in like 1918.
Wow. And that's a cleaning solvent?
No, it was So the Solway process was a chemical process. Mm-hmm. And they had the Solvay, which was in Belgium. They had the Solvay company, which had the Solvay conferences. And that was where like Einstein and like all of these top, chemists from all over Europe and the world would go to these Solway conferences. And then when they had, the trouble with World War II, then you had people, coming to America or different places. And that was, but it was the United Chemical. It also merges with, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to look up what it's also I forget the other part of it. They had the petroleum part in California also, but that was Allied Signal, the Signal Corporation. That was the California part, the Flying Tigers. But
there's still a Signal Hill, California, by the way. It used to be owned by the Signal Oil Company.
But
Signal Hill, yeah.
And I know I'm just like all over the map, but part of the intrigue with the Edwin Pauley, because he was the California schools and the big petroleum guy and got in the big fights with Harold Ickes. Mm-hmm. He was also involved in Zapata oil deals with the Bushes and with Eugene Mayer and with Philip Graham. And so he's an interesting character for me. I don't, obviously want any of the Indiana Poly people to be dark characters, but he's in some bad places historically.
Well, Detroit Dave, you go where the research leads you. You're very truthful about warts and all. There's, unlike the school curriculum, you will tell it all here. And I appreciate, I'm sure the audience appreciates your honesty and the tenacity in which you have approached your life's work, really. So is there a book in the works here? I know you've been asked this before. I'd like to see it.
There needs
I'd like
to
to be
be,
able
and
to have it laid out and read it.
I need to really lock in and do that. I told John O'Laughlin this the last time. Like, I'm actually in my sister's childhood bedroom right now in the house that I grew up in Birmingham, and right across the street from me is where Dutch Leonard first lived. Then he lived in the house diagonally behind me,
Mm-hmm.
and then at the end of his life, he lived on Yarmouth in Birmingham. So my sister lives in Dutch Leonard's second house now, and it has the Dutch Leonard writing room. So I feel like I need to draw the inspiration of Elmore Leonard, and then the other prolific writer that I need to channel is Sue Grafton, who was the best friend of my
oh no.
So my mom's best friend Pam from college, when she lived in Montecito, her best friend was Sue Grafton.
Your mother lived in Montecito?
My mom's best friend from college, her old roommate.
And who lives in Montecito now?
She lives in Montecito now. But
who were her neighbors? I'm asking you.
Her neighbors were the San Ysidro Ranch and Oprah Winfrey.
Yes. And the Harry and Meghan.
And she reported that Harry was going to the polo club before it was reported. But yeah, she's a fascinating character. This was Sue Grafton's best friend in California. And so she has all those.
Elmore Leonard is related to the other Leonard?
No, Elmore Leonard was originally, I think, from Mississippi, but he lived in Michigan almost his whole life.
I see. Yeah.
And Sue Grafton was originally from Louisville, Kentucky, and she was a Commonwealth girl, and then moved to California and became a huge writer. And she did not like going to Louisville because nobody knew who she was. But if she went to the restaurants and stuff in Montecito, everybody knew who she was. So she's a fascinating character because, she was like was friends with the detectives in Santa Barbara County or whatever, and would do all these cold blood stories and everything. And that was that was the other major writer that I feel like was sort of fringe connected, but that was the
well, as you draw inspiration from those writers, I think you couldn't have picked any better, except your material is based on lived experience, historical documents. They're writing creative fiction, but you're mining different territory. So I'm interested to see what you produce. That'll be great. In the meantime, where can we find your work? I know you're on X, active on X.
Yeah, mostly X is where I think of that sort of as my writer's notes. So like when I get ideas or things that I'm sort of putting together and trying to build connections or a sort of a network map for myself. That's how my method is to to do it that way. And then I do I do shows with John O'Laughlin about every 2 weeks, 3 weeks a month. So I'm still doing those, and then just trying to stay up with current events. And but I do want to write something, because I do feel like there are a lot of really historically interesting connections on stuff. So
Well, Corky Goss says Solvay, New York, baby. I don't know
so
the reference. Huh? Corky Goss.
Corky, I will always love about Corky is he's from Waterford Kettering High School, named after Charles Kettering.
He's from Oakland County, he says.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Waterford. He's from
Oh, okay.
Waterford, and
All right.
so he went to the way you can always remember Corky is because he went to the same school and is in the same year as Kirk Gibson, who was
Wow.
a heroic Detroit Tiger, and if you were a Los Angeles Dodger fan, he had one of the most iconic moments in the history of Major League Baseball.
We won't talk about that.
Oh, are you an Oakland A's fan?
No, I'm a Dodger
Are you
fan, but I know what you're referring to.
Are you a Dennis Eckersley fan? I didn't know.
No. I mean, you're talking about how he booted the play at first base? No.
No, remember he had the home run against Dennis Eckersley when it was the
Yes,
Dodgers against
yeah.
the A's, and he kind
No.
of had the chopping home run, and he kind of hobbled around, and it was doing the fist pump thing.
Yeah.
He's
No, I'm a
Waterford
Dodger.
all the way.
I'm a
And
Dodger
Michigan
fan.
State.
I know
He's a
you're
Michigan State guy.
you're a Tigers fan, I'm sure. No.
I'm a Tigers fan. Because that that, and again, what we were started off with the auto people. So on Martell Drive, which goes into Cranbrook, Peter Booth's family lived on there, and then across the street was Mickey Briggs. Mickey Briggs, his dad was the owner of the Detroit Tigers, and then his brother-in-law was Philip Hart, like the Senator Hart. And Hart is intriguing because he was hospitalized with Bob Dole and with the Hawaiian senator,
Inouye.
Daniel. They were all at the Kellogg Sanitarium, which was the war hospital in World War II.
Wow.
And so Philip Hart was the senator from Michigan, and he married Mickey Briggs' sister, who was like an astronaut. She was an aviation pioneer and like qualified to be a female astronaut, all this stuff. And they lived on the same Martell Drive across from, and they were another automotive carriage maker. So the Briggs, was carriage maker like Fisher. And then, and then all it's crazy the people, because even the hot dogs, which I feel like was so popular with the whole QAnon story. The hot dog manufacturer for the Detroit Tigers is the Ballpark Frank, which
yes, they're in the markets.
They plump when you cook them, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that
I like the Dodger dogs. Huh?
What's that?
I like the Dodger dogs.
You like whatever you grew up on.
They're a foot long.
I love the Detroit Tiger. I love the Ballpark Frank. But the girl that's running for Senate right now, Alyssa Slotkin, that's on the Intelligence Committee with Adam Schiff and all, the congressional. Her family is the high grade meats that makes Ballpark Franks, and so she's trying to step up from the Congress to the Senate right now. So she's running, and then her brother Keith was my classmate for years.
Wow.
And she was a Cranbrook person, so we know, her family. So so all the Tiger stuff, all the because there's a lot there. The Briggs had the problem with the racism and not hiring Black players, and that became a big problem. And then when Walter Briggs died, Comerica Bank took the team from the Briggs family. Then it became the pizza tycoons that bought it. It was Monahan, the Domino's, and it was Ilitch, the Little Caesars. So all those things are crazy.
Detroit Dave, you've got it all under your belt. Can hardly wait to see this book come out. And you have a consultant here named Kathy Sue. Seems that she's a Sue Grafton fan as well.
Well, I feel like a lot of people are. I feel like she's a top, like one of the most. I mean, I feel like there's the Harry Potter books, and then like John Grisham, and but she's in probably the top 10.
Elmore Leonard, you mentioned. Elmore Leonard is definitely one.
Elmore Leonard is wild because the guy that you like to kind of nag a little bit, Quentin Tarantino.
Oh, him, yeah.
his creation story was that he stole an Elmore Leonard book from a Kmart in Tennessee. And the thing that's wild is that Kmart, of course, is a Detroit company. Sebastian Kresge,
Oh,
the
yeah,
Kmart,
Kresge's.
and
Yeah.
Sally Cunningham, whose dad is I'm blanking on the Cunningham. He was the founder of Kmart. I forget his name, but she was classmates with my dad in high school. So like she was like the crush girl or whatever. And then when I was in high school, the Sebastian Kresge's great granddaughter was like the ski team rival or whatever. So all these, intrigues, and it is partly why like with I feel like you promote Kirby Summers a lot, and I have kind of a conflict with her. And part of the specific reason is because of what she said, and that I was friends with Jeff Epstein. I don't know him, and I've tried to be very honest about the people I do know.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't appreciate that because it was her. She did it with Richard Poe, who is an author that's getting a lot of pub right now. They sort of did a little like 1-2 thing, and the thing that bothers me is that like the Kresge, like when they built the Olympic Tower in New York, it was like it was the Rickless, that group that she knows very well, but it was also the people that were partnered with the Kmart family and Aristotle Onassis, and so all these characters have like strong ties here because like Onassis' like rival, who was Stavros Narchos, like he was married to Charlotte Ford, and like their child lives here in Birmingham. So so I try to be very honest about like who I know, who I don't know. And so I was like, that really, really bothered me that happened. But that was, but I've said the people in that network that I do know, and my suspicions on people. So there are definitely people that are connected to that network, but I have not personally ever met him.
Well, you've clarified it here. You do not know. You have never met Jeffrey Epstein.
No.
He's just an object of fascination to a lot of us. What I like about her work is that she, again, like you, she brings in the Midwest and puts it in the foreground where it belongs.
The other thing that I wrote a couple weeks ago on your in the comment section was I said to dig into the Talk magazine. Are you familiar with Talk magazine?
Not really, but I didn't know it existed.
Look into it really carefully because it was it's the publisher of it was Tina Brown, who you've talked
I know
a lot
about her.
with Tina. She's a very significant character, but she made it with Miramax, so it was with the Weinstein brothers, and it was a joint deal between Tina Brown, Miramax. I don't know the guy's name, but he was the inspiration for Mr. Big on Sex and the City.
Chris Noth?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think, or not Chris North. That was the actor. Whoever the guy, the publisher in real life that was based off of him, and then Hearst magazine. So that's a very interesting. Because I know you love to look at the magazines and sort of these like British intriguers, and that's
the assets who control American publishing, like Tina Brown.
Do you know who was her writer at Talk magazine? Vicky Ward.
Who?
Vicky Ward.
Vicky Ward.
Before Vanity Fair was at Talk.
You have to read her stuff with sort of a grain of salt.
And Tucker worked there.
Do you mean as in Carlson?
He was a political commentator with Jake Tapper.
Yeah.
Look into Talk magazine. I'm telling you, it's a very juicy one that you'll like.
Is it available? I mean, I like the National Enquirer. That's about my speed.
You can do it. The problem is my sister was the president of Hearst magazine. She was the assistant to the president of Hearst magazine.
Your sister?
So she used to get a Christmas present from Tina Brown and Helen Gurley Brown. She used to serve Coke Classic to Harvey Weinstein in the president's conference room. in the Hearst building, you know, right at, was it 57th and 6th, 7th Avenue or
I mean,
whatever?
where you're broadcasting right now, that's her house?
No, this
What?
is the bedroom, the childhood bedroom of the girl that worked in the Hearst building, my sister.
Okay, I get it.
And
Wow.
so she was the assistant to,
Yeah,
but she worked very closely with this talk group because this was a huge deal. I mean,
I
this
see.
is in 1999. This is
Mhm.
when the Weinstein brothers are top of the world. There's
Right.
none of the scandal stuff has emerged. They're just knocking out hits year after year. You know, they're at the top of the world. So there, it was a big deal when he came in. So it wasn't like sketchy in '99.
Mhm.
So all these people were coming into her office, and that was where they, make this talk magazine, and then right after that, they make the Oprah magazine. And so
Yes.
then Oprah and Gail were coming in, and so my sister would be, working with them too. So all these, you know, uh, New York connections. That's why, like, I'm very, 'cause I lived there. My sister and I both lived in New York for a while, but
Uh-huh.
that whole thing was like literally had
This is when you were
the
on Wall Street
I worked
in
for
New York?
Anderson Consulting.
In New
So I
York.
was at Arthur Anderson at
Arthur
this point.
Anderson,
So I
yeah.
was working at the Alliance Capitol building, which
Mhm.
is on 54th and 6th Avenue, right next to the
Yeah.
Hilton,
Close to
and
CBS, I think, right?
very close to CBS. It's close to CBS. It's close to the Hilton. It's next to the Sherry Netherland, where or not the Sherry Netherland, but the Parker Meridian, where what's his name got blasted in the Anastasia or whatever, got blasted in the barber chair.
Oh, Albert Anastasia?
I think so. That was I think it was at the Parker Meridian next to where I worked.
Okay, that's early. He was Murder
This was in
Incorporated.
the 30s probably.
That's Albert Anastasia.
But that yeah, so I was working at Anderson, and
Mhm.
this is during the Enron era too. So that was intriguing. My sister was working at Hearst magazines, and the Hearst building is, now the Hearst Tower, or whatever, with the thing. So that's where she was working, and she was meeting all. So like when people talk about like the royalty of publishing, like I didn't know any of these characters, but I learned who all of them were because Kathy Black, who was the president of Hearst, who'd been the CEO of Gannett
Mhm.
previously, was the rival of Anna Wintour. And
Oh,
Anna Wintour,
wow.
yeah, because it was the Condé Nast and and Hearst was known
Yeah.
as like the family, and it was Condé Nasty, and they were like the
Well,
hot
Condé Nast
girl.
came out of Ohio originally.
Yeah,
Condé
they were
Nast.
the hot girls that you were kind of the bratty, hot girls was Condé Nast, and Hearst was the family, if you believe
Uh-huh.
that, with William Randolph Hearst.
Uh-huh.
But but that was where she had all these like celebrities that would go through, and then they would have these magazine parties, the launch parties, and so I would get to
Oh
go
my
with her
gosh.
to some of these and see the celebrities and all that. So that was
Did
very
did Richard Gere ever show up to one of these
I never saw
soiree?
Richard Gere. I saw Diana Ross was probably the biggest star, and this was at Cipriani across from Grand Central. It was the Oprah magazine party,
Mhm.
and Diana Ross smiled at me, and it was very exciting for me. And Rick Olson, who watches this show, who's very into the music world as well, he said that was
Yes.
a big deal. That Diana Ross is
Yeah.
not normally a smiler.
No, she's a diva.
Well, I think she knew that I knew that she grew up in the Marcy Project, or I mean
Oh,
the Brewster Projects in Detroit.
yes.
I
The
think
women
she
of
knew that
Brewster
I
Street,
knew that she was Brewster Project's girl, and that's why she smiled at me.
because you're Detroit Dave. You know
Because I
well.
love the Motown and Berry Gordy, and and even though I wasn't alive, I wouldn't want them to move from Detroit to Los Angeles.
That was the worst move they could
I
make, but
wanted to
yeah.
stay in Detroit.
Yeah, of course. Well, maybe they'll reverse migrate. Well, they're owned by MCA or somebody
The
else by
the
now.
last the
Yeah.
last of the legends just died
Mm.
last week. It was Duke Fakir, who was one of the original members of the Four Tops. He just passed away, and he was the
Yeah.
last
I met
survivor
I
of
met him. He's
his
got the beard.
daughter.
Yeah.
His daughter Farah was my sister's friend. That she went to Liggett in Grosse Pointe, and then went to camp with my sister, and they were the nicest family. And I know you love your Boule in Detroit talk, but
Yes, I
that's
do.
their network of people are the big hitters in that
I like
stuff.
me some black boule.
And they went to Country Day. Their families went to Country Day, and they were. It's why it's conflicting to me. They were outstanding families. They were nice
Mhm.
parents. They had really smart kid. So it's very conflicting with all these things for me because
Believe me, I have no problem with it. I
it's
do
it's
not
a mixed
everything
bag. I mean, I feel
Yeah,
like you saw it. You see the
yeah,
different characters from the same
mhm,
families, and people have different personalities, and some
yeah,
people are great and some people are terrible.
yeah. Well, David, I hope your sister sits for an interview with you so you can get all those juicy stories. That would just be one volume alone would
Yeah.
sell, and we'll have you back on, well, hopefully before then, and we'll promote the hell out of that book.
All right. I
'Cause
got to get
but
going. I got to
but
lock into it. I know, but thank you for the encouragement. I really
yeah,
appreciate it.
if I can help you anyway, let me know.
Thank you.
I'm a published author, and I have a good editorial eye, and I can ask you, "Well, what about this? What about that? How about let me hear some more about this?" So I'll be glad to do that for you.
And I also appreciate that you are a Bowling Green person, an Ohio
Yes,
educated. I love that.
I
But
love
I
the
also
Midwest,
like
man.
that you have the California school system because I feel like Edwin Pauley is sort of an understudied character that's really important, and he ties into the school systems a lot with Reagan and Edwin Meese and all these guys. But
Yeah.
his petroleum career is really interesting also, and and I feel like because you've studied the California schools, you understand the roles of the regents and
Mhm.
how that role is important.
Absolutely. I'll definitely be looking into him and any number of the names that you name check today. I'll be looking into them further. David Cranmer Underdown, it's been a pleasure. I know the audience is getting a kick out of it. You really opened up and you spilled some tea. So
All
thank you.
right.
I
Well,
appreciate that.
it's like the Boston Tea Party all over again. We're
All
dumping
right.
tea.
Okay,
Okay.
Detroit David, we'll see you later. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.